Good morning and welcome to today's webinar, Diversity, Inclusion, and Implicit Bias, presented by our sponsor, Heffernan. We're super happy you can join us. My name is Michelle Wilcox and I will be your moderator today. I will also be monitoring questions you may have during the session. Before we open up the session, let's review a couple of key items. All the webinar materials we discuss can be found at the URL currently showing on your screen. I will be sharing this URL in a follow-up email, so don't feel like you need to write it down right now. If you have trouble with your internet connection during the webinar, we recommend leaving the presentation and logging back in. We do not control the audio, your devices do. If you have audio difficulties, try adjusting the volume settings on your device. If a telephone line goes down during the call, hang up and call back again to the same number. If all lines go dead, watch the on-screen chat box for an alternative call-in number. Feel free to ask questions or provide feedback by using the chat box or questions box during the webinar. If you're using a tablet, you may need to tap on the screen for the options bar to appear, and then you can select the appropriate option. We may not respond immediately, but we will work your questions or feedback into the presentation. If we can't get to your comment or question during the session, we will be online afterwards to respond, or we may follow up in an email if we run completely out of time. You may also email us at moderator@aspenrmg.com for up to 48 hours after the webinar. This will be a 1-hour session. Questions and comments are very much encouraged throughout, and the presenter will be answering questions at the end. And lastly, if we have a number of upcoming webinars covering a variety of topics, including those listed at the Heffernan webinar website. In addition, we are offering the mandatory preventing sexual harassment training on June 17th this year. With that, let's begin today's webinar, Diversity, Inclusion, and Implicit Bias. Our presenter today is Deb Beto. Deb is a senior professional in human resources, and her professional experience spans over 30 years. 12 years ago, she founded her company called Your Ops Manager that manages the business operations of small businesses, including all of the elements of human resources. As an advisor to companies of less than 50 employees, Deb has been advising employers about discrimination, retaliation, and sexual harassment prevention since 2010. With that, I'm going to go ahead and turn the presentation over to you, Deb.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here today. We've got quite a few attendees. Before we begin the presentation today, I would like to acknowledge that there are a lot of changes happening as we speak at the federal government level as far as DEI initiatives go. As a result, there are companies that are choosing to drop their formal DEI programs. And whether companies keep DEI or stop talking about it and training to it, how we treat people is still important. Understanding the benefits of diversity and what equity and inclusion really mean is also still really important. So I thank you for participating in this webinar today. And I hope that nothing changes in the 1 hour that we'll be spending together that will make anything that I recite today as untrue. So thank you for your understanding. So this is just some content disclaimer. The information presented is general in nature and is intended to be presented as an overview of employment practices. The written and verbal contents of the presentation are not intended to constitute consulting or legal advice, and no client relationship is established between the presenter and the attendees. Oh boy. Okay, so our agenda today, we're going to talk about what diversity is. We are going to go through some scenarios to discover whether bias really is an issue in the workplace. We're going to talk about how to move past bias and encourage others to do the same, and which should foster an environment of inclusion. And then we'll end the session today with any questions. So I'm going to start today with Michelle kicking off the presentation with some polling questions. So I just want to kind of get a feel out there for how your company views diversity and inclusion. So your company champions diversity and inclusion in all aspects of employment. Is this true, false, maybe, or you don't know?
Okay, I've launched the poll and we appreciate your participation, and I'm going to give it a few minutes here so that everybody has a chance to select their options. And Let's see here. Okay, I am going to close the poll. It looks like majority majority of the audience says that maybe sometimes we get it right, but there's still work to do. And then the second most popular is true. We've got a lot. I'm sorry,
Got it
we've
all
got it
figured
all
out.
figured
Wow,
out.
that's great. That's great. So the concept of diversity is about acceptance and respect. It means understanding that every person is different, but in a lot of ways, people are the same. It's a workplace that provides a place for women, veterans, LGBTQ employees, people of color, people with disabilities, working parents, and just about anybody to be able to connect and help ensure that the workplace welcomes and supports their productivity. It ensures that systems are in place to recognize all types of workers, virtual, in-person, hybrid, or otherwise. It's about learning to understand yourself and other people so that we can work together. It's about how we view the world and not how everyone sees things the same way. And one thing to understand is that human beings are ethnocentric. They like what's the same as them. That's just human nature. That's why you may share a lot of similarities with friends that you choose. However, at work, we don't have the opportunity to pick our coworkers, our boss, or even the executives in the company. In those cases, we need to understand our own programming before we can understand others. Our life experience has shaped us into the person that we are, good and bad, and no matter how different people are, we still share one thing in common, the human experience. If we are a manager, we have the opportunity to pick our team. But what happens if you pick people who all look different but think just like you? Well, when we look at problems, diversity matters. If we have different backgrounds and perspectives, we see problems differently and come up with more creative solutions. We can learn from each other. We can learn from others' experiences. We can learn to see the world in a different way. I remember the first time I traveled to Japan. Luckily, I was prepared beforehand. In Japan, if someone gives you a business card, it is disrespectful to tuck it into your pocket or inside your briefcase. The expectation is that you keep it in front of you the entire time you're meeting. Had I not known that, I could have easily offended someone. Different cultures have different programming and different expectations. So let's talk about the definitions of some things that we're going to be discussing today. So diversity is people or the quantitative experience. Inclusion is the qualitative experience, the environment those people are in. Implicit bias is unconscious beliefs that form our judgment, decisions, and behaviors. We're going to talk a lot today about these unconscious beliefs because unconsciously they are driving how we treat other people, and we may not even know it. So this is a really important subject to discuss. Diversity and inclusion can easily become just more buzzwords or acts of political correctness to check off a box. The value of diversity cannot be recognized without the component of inclusion. So let's start with bias in the workplace. Bias in the workplace is the purposeful or accidental assumptions made when hiring candidates, delegating tasks, or comparing employees in other ways. In most cases, bias is either conscious or unconscious, both of which require awareness and training to combat. Conscious bias is an active, understood, and calculated choice to act in a certain way. You already know that you are acting in this way. So with conscious bias, you're aware of the decisions you're making and you know what's motivating them. Unconscious bias, which is also called implicit bias, is a behavior, an action, or an inaction to a person that you perform unconsciously. Unlike conscious bias, people who exhibit unconscious bias have no idea they're acting in a way that favors some people and excludes others. And since it's often unrecognizable to the person demonstrating it, unconscious bias can be very challenging to combat without effective training. Bias in the workplace. In a Deloitte survey, 64% of workers surveyed felt that they had experienced bias in their workplaces during the last year. And of those, 61% felt they experienced bias in the workplace at least once a month. That's pretty frequent. Of the majority who felt they witnessed or experienced bias in the past year, 83% categorized it as indirect and subtle, compared to 32% who categorized bias as blatant and obvious. So next, I'm going to show you a slide. I'm going to show it to you quickly, and then I'm going to ask you to tell me what you saw. So pay attention, it's going to go fast. Okay, Michelle, I'll do that one more time. On the previous slide, what did you see?
Again, we thank you for your participation. And I'm going to give it just a second here. It looks like 73%, well, actually 70% said good. The other majority said both good and evil.
All right. So if we back up and look at it again, we can see the word good in black, and inside that we can see the word evil in white. There's really no wrong answer to this question. A normal human brain can look at things or images differently, forming a different perception from each angle. And this is an example of your implicit bias at work. Our first impressions often determine how we perceive another person. This is the same person in different clothes. For example, a candidate for a position who has a very strong first impression will likely be evaluated more favorably, even if it's unwarranted. They don't have to work as hard to prove themselves. How long does this take, and what are we noticing? The science of people tells us that most people make a first impression within 7 seconds. And experiments by Princeton researchers suggest that people can make judgments of others within 1/10 of a second. We use things like race, perceived sexual orientation, accent, clothing, and firmness of a handshake to tell us about warmth and even competence. Before you've even talked to someone, you've made a judgment about their competence. That's your unconscious bias. Stereotypes are preconceived notions and beliefs based on limited experience and what we've heard secondhand. They're seldom neutral, but they often have a negative connotation. Even if the assumptions are positive, they can be just as detrimental to the individual and the group. Think about it. What are your assumptions about used car salesmen, politicians, maybe New Yorkers? And what comes to mind? What do you tend to expect from them? Now, on the other hand, what are your assumptions about older people with small dogs, high school students in athletic uniforms, or women wearing tailored suits? Are your expectations more positive than in the first 3 examples? Stereotypes are non-rational, they're not logical. How can you possibly know a person will behave a certain way in certain circumstances? Only through direct experience with that individual can you better understand their probable behavior. And even then, people can surprise you. Stereotypes are also difficult to change. Once opinions are formed, it can be extremely difficult to change. Don't bother me with the facts. I know better. And stereotypes may achieve a self-fulfilling prophecy. What we think becomes real. We look for behavior that validates our beliefs. People start performing to the level we expect of them. Stereotypes thrive on generalization with limited experience, not based on evidence, but based on hearsay. Stereotypes are a two-sided coin, victims and perpetrators with a strong emotional response. Stereotypes thrive on generalization. Think about it. What comes to mind when I say used car salesman? We may think of words like swindlers, sleazy, crooked, or pushy. Sure, there may be some dishonest used car salespeople, but the whole industry can't be bad. But think about how these stereotypes are perpetuated through TV, movies, maybe or even some of our life experiences. How did this all get started? Someone interacted with a shady used car salesman, told their friends, and then things became a self-fulfilling prophecy. So here are some examples of implicit bias, which is a bias you may not even understand that you have. So reflexively laughing at an offensive joke, just thinking to yourself, that overweight person should not be eating that third cookie, or having an uncomfortable reaction when you see two people of the same sex showing affection, refusing to make eye contact with a young male of color, hiring a younger candidate who is more familiar with technology than an older candidate who's more experienced in the field. There was a science experiment done at the University of Innsbruck in 1950 by Professor Theodore Erisman and also his assistant and student Ivo Kohler. The experiment was a test of people's interpretation of visual cues. The student was given eyeglasses which turned the world upside down. The student had to suffer with upside down images for a week or two. But after that, his brain learned to turn the images back over again. So he was seeing things right side up, even though he was still wearing the glasses. The same thing happens when we hear something we know is wrong. Our brain fixes it. And given our tendency to hear what we expect to hear or what we want to hear, it's very easy to people in conflict to misunderstand each other. Communication is already likely to be strained, and people will most likely want to hide the truth to some extent. The potential for misinterpretations, misperceptions, and misunderstandings is very high. So how do we learn about our misconceptions? We have to understand our culture. Culture works like your computer software. It takes in information and produces a response, often without consulting the user. The user is us, that's us, our conscious mind. Without software, a computer is just a 20-pound paperweight. Culture consists of unwritten rules. Without them, we wouldn't know how to handle new situations. They're absorbed unconsciously, and it directs the most subtle aspects of our behavior. When to smile, when it's okay to interrupt, things like that. Remember the first time you went to a friend's house for dinner and they served something you had never seen before? What did you do? Did you eat it anyway? Why? Most of us were taught that that's the polite thing to do. How about riding in the elevator? When the elevator doors open, we wait for others to get off and then we get on. That's an unwritten rule. Why is that a rule? We all, also in an elevator, we all turn around and face towards the door. What if you got in and turned the opposite way facing the back? Would that be strange for other people? So there are unwritten rules that we all live by. And once we recognize what our programming teaches us, we have the capacity to control our choices. It's like sending a Microsoft document to a Macintosh Apple user. You have to make some adjustments so that they can read it, but if you know that in advance, you can do it. I'm losing my voice here, hold on. Take a little sip there of my water. All right. So late one night, here's a story for you. Late one night, a man searches for something in a parking lot. On his hands and knees, he crawls around a bright circle of light created by a street lamp overhead. A woman passes, she stops, and she takes in the scene. What are you looking for? Can I help? He says, my car keys. Any chance you've seen them? And she says, well, you dropped them right around here? And he says, oh, no, I dropped them way over there, he says, gesturing vaguely to some faraway spot on the other side of the lot. Then why are you looking here? The man pauses to consider the question and then answers, because this is where the light is. Many people look for disruptive behavior in much the same way, in just one place, waiting for it to appear. The problem with this strategy, besides it being inefficient, is that because of implicit bias, people are spending too much time watching for the stereotypes and expecting the worst. Bias causes people to rely on assumptions to inform how they read and react to various situations. The more you're exposed to stereotypes, the stronger the unconscious association becomes. This affects our quick decision making, those that have to be made right away. That's why it's helpful to slow things down and take time to make important decisions with the right information. How you feel in the moment isn't necessarily the answer. And this goes back to science again. Back when we were in our survival instinct, we didn't have the luxury of time. When we were confronted with a saber-toothed tiger, we had to either fight it or run away. And so when we have to make a quick decision, we're in that area of our brain that thrives on generalizations and stereotypes. It takes time and attention to get out of that part of the brain and into what's known as higher ordered thinking or critical thinking. That's where we can analyze the question. Sometimes we get triggered and it puts us back into the fight or flight mode. We go back into the primal stance, ready to fight, blame others, and assign meanings based on our hardwiring. That's when empathy is diminished. We are only thinking of ourselves and we're being selfish. Nowadays, we have people who are transgender and identify themselves as non-binary, which means they don't view themselves as either male or female. They will ask you to use the they, them pronouns when referring to them. And this may not feel normal to someone because in the English language, they, them refers to multiple people. It may be natural to feel the difficulty of this, and using the correct pronouns when referring to this person may come across as not feeling right to you. But have you ever stopped to think how hard it is for them? Obviously, the discomfort you may feel with remembering to use their correct pronouns is far less in comparison than what this person may feel like just having to be transgender and make that a part of their life. And once you understand the situational nature of stereotypes and bias, you can learn to have power over it. That puts you back in the higher, more complex thinking region part of the brain and not the reactive part of the brain. So what if you're evaluating a job candidate to lead a new office? On paper, this is by far the most qualified person you've seen. Her responses to your interview questions are flawless. She has impeccable social skills. Still, something doesn't feel right. You can't put your finger on it. You just have a sense. Do you hire them? So Michelle's going to launch a polling question so that you can break your decision down.
Okay, so the options are no, I'm going to go along with my gut. B, yes, I'm going to give her a chance. Or C, I don't know. And we'll give it a couple seconds here. Everybody to pull.
So there's no right or wrong answer to this. So while you're thinking about your response, I'm going to give you some food for thought. Are you hiring for a fit and this candidate is not it? Sometimes the candidate's profile or image or personal brand doesn't fit with what you or the hiring manager has in mind for the role. It doesn't mean that they aren't competent or capable. It just means that there's a different vision of who the company wanted before meeting anyone. Do you or the hiring manager have a specific person in mind that you really wanted to hire all along? It happens. Sometimes there's an internal candidate or someone who was referred for the job by an insider who is already a clear front runner for the position. And Michelle, I'm going to have you hold off just one more second. There's also a possibility that this person made a bad first impression. We've mentioned before that we decide about a person within 7 seconds of meeting them. Does this candidate remind you of someone? Do they resemble a bully who used to pick on you or the hiring manager in high school? Do they look like someone you've had issues managing in the past? Recognize that it could be your biases creeping in and try to look at the candidate from a more objective point of view. So Michelle, what did our audience say?
Okay, majority said that yes, they were going to give her a chance. Then followed up with no, I'm going with my gut. And then lastly, I don't know.
Okay, well, like I said, there's no wrong answer because it depends on the other parts of the scenario. Again, yes, I'm going to give her a chance. Maybe you're recognizing that you might have some implicit biases. No, I'm going with my gut might mean that they had a different vision for the type of candidate that would be coming into this position. So what now? Awareness is not enough. You have to do something about it. Work has to be conscious, not unconscious, and intentional. And we know what works when it's evaluated. In ourselves, we can continue to test. And here's are some things you can try to expand your awareness of your thoughts and behaviors. So you can identify instances where implicit bias may be impacting your behavior. Be specific, like always baking with your daughter and playing basketball with your son. Act friendlier. Behavior influences our thoughts. Be aware of your positive stereotypes. They may seem harmless, but they can still register as offensive to those on the receiving end. Hang out with people with expanded viewpoints. Expose yourself to media that aims to break down prejudice. Make your circle bigger, positive contact with equal status, working together. And try not to make quick decisions. Slow down, take time, use algorithms, examine where your reactions come from. Sorry, another sip here. I'm just getting over a cold, so my voice is just coming back. So what should you do if you have to fact check yourself? The best thing to do is ask questions instead of assigning your own meaning. Most people will not be offended if you genuinely want to understand, and when you do this, you have to watch your tone. Don't accuse, don't blame, and also watch your body language. Start with something that shows your desire for wanting to learn. Something like, hey, I noticed that when we're talking, you don't look me in the eye. The way that I was raised, that could be a sign of dishonesty, but I don't want to assume anything. Can you tell me why, when we're talking, that you don't like to look directly at me? Sometimes this will go well, sometimes it won't. But just because it backfires once does not mean you give up. Keep trying. In the meantime, keep positive intent in mind. Stay curious, ask questions. And as you do this, you become a role model. Every situation will not be easy. Sometimes there will be misunderstandings. And if others see you as someone who is willing to try, they will be more likely to try too. So now that we've learned how to identify and address our own biases, how do we confront bias, and really not just in the workplace, but in any situation? How should we respond when we recognize and witness someone making an offensive comment? Well, obviously it depends, right? It depends on what it is, who said it, who they said it to, and what circumstances or environment you're in. In order to respond appropriately, we first have to be able to recognize a microaggression. A microaggression is an indirect, subtle, or unintentional discrimination against members of a marginalized group. Some examples might be, there's only one race, the human race. She's really smart for a woman. Or complimenting someone's English just because they have an accent. As we grow in our cultural competency and develop our awareness, we become better and better at recognizing microaggressions and biased comments so that we can avoid them and ultimately respond appropriately to them. One of the first things that needs to be done when you hear a comment fueled by implicit bias is to make the invisible visible. Often the person who makes the remark is unaware that they've even made an offensive comment, so you need to make it visible to them. Maybe this can't be done immediately, and maybe it needs to wait until a later time when you're able to be one-on-one with the individual. If it needs to wait until a later time, you can disarm the microaggression by steering the conversation away from the remark or joke to communicate that it's offensive. You'd be modeling good behavior to the other people present, and then you can have a conversation later with the person who made the comment. When you do respond to the bias, whether that be immediately or later, you want to come from a place of education. You want to keep it about the impact that the comment had, not the intent of the comment. Impact supersedes intent. You can't prove intent, so you will lose that argument every time. How many times have you said to someone that what they said was offensive and they responded with, well, that wasn't my intention at all. Why are you so sensitive? Or something similar to that. But focusing on the impact is an easier way to get a person to understand what happened and how they may have caused pain. Another way to get someone to understand that is what they say may be coming from a place of bias is to ask them to be specific. This is something that may come up with work more often in hiring committees or deliberations about a candidate, or even in a friendly office conversation. Asking people to be specific might help bring some education into the situation. So let's move on to including now. Inclusion is the practice of providing everyone with equal access to opportunities and resources. Efforts include creating opportunities for historically marginalized groups, which a means to be equal in the workplace. Companies with more ethnically and gender diverse executive teams are more likely to outperform their competition. And Glassdoor found that 76% of employees and job seekers consider diversity an important element of their workplace, which affects recruitment and retention. Inclusion comes from the top down. So any organization that's going to work on being inclusive needs to start with the leaders first. Human resources cannot do this alone. This work has to be strategic and an intentional priority. Even when we set out on this journey together, there are going to be things that make people uncomfortable. For instance, think back to your first job. Maybe it was working retail or in a fast food place. Your old boss had their favorites, right? The ones who would also get the best shifts or could take longer breaks. Maybe there was a clique who seemed above the rules, always working together and putting distance between themselves and the other workers. It was a hostile environment, wasn't it? People were treated differently, and it was impossible to raise these concerns because the boss just didn't care. Inclusion in the workplace is all about tackling these kinds of problems to create teams that are more connected and helping you identify what your office is guilty of and what to do about it. All employees deserve workplaces that enable them to feel welcome and do their best work. Characterizing accommodations as special treatment reinforces the stigma for individuals with disabilities by describing their needed accommodations as a burden or exception to the rule. The E in the DEI initiative stands for equity. Equality is treating everyone the same, while equity is providing people with the resources they need to succeed. I think this picture is a really good example. Everyone's the same, everyone's standing on the same size bucket under the equality definition, but under the equity, the people are given the resources they need to be able to succeed. Equality assumes that everyone starts from the same place, as in this situation on the left, while equity acknowledges that people have different circumstances. Culture is experience-based. You aren't born with it. Here's a list of tools that can help you understand how your culture is playing into your decisions. Challenge the assumptions, check your reality, be flexible. Assume positive intent. Most people don't get up in the morning thinking, how can I offend people today? Generate multiple interpretations. Crossed arms, lack of eye contact, nodding, for example, can all mean different things. It doesn't necessarily mean what you think it might mean. It is a difference that makes a difference. When considering individuals of differing age, gender, ethnicity, education, could they have a good idea? Can they lift that 20-pound box? Could they lift a 50-pound box? Should I offer to shake hands? Should they get that promotion? Does their paperwork have priority? Be aware. And one more tool that's available to help discover hidden cognitive biases comes from a research project conducted at Harvard University. There, if you do a Google search or an internet search for the Harvard implicit bias test, you will see not only thousands of pages of research, but there are thousands of companies that can help or that are using that research to come into organizations to help them uncover their own implicit biases. The Harvard research said that most people are aware of their own overt biases, but it's very difficult for us to become aware of our covert biases. The Harvard Implicit Bias Test, and this is a test that you can take online, is excellent for showing bias and how our unconscious drives our day-to-day decision making. It helps all of us from all backgrounds recognize unconscious hidden biases, which may unknowingly distort our objective evaluation and treatment of others based on things like race, gender, religion, culture, and other elements. This tool was developed by a group of researchers from Harvard University and has proven validity. There's a link to the test if you want to take it. It's right here at the right underneath where it says Harvard Implicit Bias Test and the HTTPS. I'll give you a second to write this down. This test is free. The results are kept confidential, but the results are tagged for research purposes. So just know that you are participating in research if you are taking this test. But it's a really good place to start. There are 3 things you should be pre-screening for before a candidate progresses through the hiring process. That's ambition, ability, and commitment. We need to focus on those 3 things, ambition, ability, and commitment, to determine the difference between high performers and high potentials. As the saying goes, if you don't ask the right questions, you won't get the right answers. So we fled through that. So Michelle, do you have any questions from the group?
We don't, Deb, but actually somebody just asked me to post the link in the chat box to that Harvard test. So I'm
Great
going to do
ideas. So here's the, if you want to put that in there, Michelle, here it is. That's a great idea.
And I'll share it with everybody. So I just sent it and we don't have any questions. I don't know if everybody's sleeping or just a lot of information to digest in less than an hour.
Yeah, and then also, I think it'd go back to our first polling question. The majority of the responses were that the companies already had it figured out. So maybe they didn't learn anything new today. Maybe this is just all part of their normal culture, which is great. And I'm hoping that the people that were the maybes got something out of this.
Yeah, and I just wanted to reiterate to everybody that I will be sending a follow-up email that will include information on how to access the presentation and the slides. So for those of you that have asked, I just wanted to throw that out there. There is one comment, a question: in light of the new administration freeze stance on DEI, what do you recommend organizations do to keep progressing?
Well, the administration has to do with the federal government, and this includes any offices of the federal government, but it also includes any contractors who are contracting with the federal government. And if you are a contractor with the federal government and you have DEI initiatives that you'd like to keep moving forward, my recommendation is that you put it into practice and not put it into writing, because if you put it in writing under the federal standards right now, you're not going to get the government contract. But that doesn't mean you don't practice it in the workplace.
Somebody asked if you could define marginalized groups.
Well, it's the marginalized people that define themselves. So we use some very broad examples today. So we use the example of, she's smart for a woman. So women could be a marginalized group. We also use the example, I'm trying to go back to my examples here. The point is, it's the person that is the receiver of the information that decides whether they're part of the marginalized group or not. And this is the same thing in any situation. It's in any comments that are directed at anybody. It's the receiver of the comment that decides whether that comment is offensive or not. And therefore, it's the receiver of the comment that needs to speak up and say, hey, I found, you probably didn't intend this, but I found that comment to be offensive towards me as a woman. The other one, there's only one race, the human race. And this came up in the Black Lives Matter situation where people came out and said, all lives matter. Well, that really made the Black culture feel marginalized. Complimenting someone's English just because they have an accent. And this might happen, you know, with a foreigner that moves here, has maybe lived here for 25 years, but still has their accent, and you compliment their English. Well, they're like, I've lived here a long time. I feel marginalized by that comment. So it's the receiver of the comment that decides whether they are offended by the comment or not. And so that's why the receivers need to speak up and say, and make the invisible visible. Hey, I didn't really appreciate that comment. It made me feel like I'm not part of the American culture, even though I've been here for 25 years. So you need to, I mean, the first place that you can look are, you know, where it is illegal to discriminate based on race, religion, sexual orientation, sex, age over 40. You can first look at, you know, where the law is, but when it comes right down to it, it's the receiver that decides whether they feel marginalized or not.
Great. What if
That's one of the importance of having workplace training on these topics, is because the receivers have not always felt comfortable speaking up. And so giving them permission to speak up and giving them a voice is part of the importance of this type of training in the workplace.
Okay, thank you, Deb. And then lastly, it says, what if you rename your DEI program and remove DEI from your site?
Well, that's part of what the government, what the federal government mandate is that if you removed it from your, if you've changed the name, you have to let them know what you changed the name to. So you can't just mask it. It's something you just put into practice and teach people to be respectful of each other. If in this and like I said, this is all unfolding as we speak. So I don't have all of the answers, because I don't even know what's transpired in the 43 minutes that we've been talking that might have changed any of this information. So we have to, you know, keep abreast of what's in the news. But my understanding right now is that they are not, they're not going to abide by just changing the name. They want
Great.
it deleted altogether.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we've got everybody addressed in the questions that came in. Thank you all for attending today's webinar presented by Heffernan. We will send the information by email with instructions on how to access a copy of the presentation on our website. Thank you, Deb, for your time and expertise today. We hope all of the attendees found today's webinar to be a valuable use of your time. Be sure to join us on February 18th for our employment law update webinar. Thank you all and have a great day.
Thank you, Michelle.